Peter Vaughn slammed the file down on the table without a second thought. "Sign it," he said. No greeting, no explanation, just a finger pressing down on my name. Now. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Peter Vaughn was the chief executive officer, and he spoke the way men do when they believe authority is gravity, something you fall into whether you want to or not. He leaned back, arms crossed, already finished with me. The message was clear. This wasn't a discussion. It was disposal. I didn't flinch. That seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. "You helped design these policies," he added, smirking. "So don't act surprised when they work." The insult was surgical. He wasn't just firing me, he was daring me to object, daring me to look emotional, daring me to break character. I was head of corporate governance and compliance. My job had never been to be liked. My job was to make sure power didn't move faster than rules. Peter had been hired to do the opposite, to cut, consolidate, and call it vision. He believed speed was leadership. I believed speed without structure was just collapse with better branding. I picked up the pen. The room tightened as I signed. Slowly, deliberately, letter by letter. Peter watched. Impatient now. "You don't need to dramatize it," he said. "This is clean, efficient." He smiled like he was doing me a favor, like my career was a file he'd just finished clearing. I kept signing. I didn't argue because arguments give men like Peter something to win. I didn't protest because protests end processes early. I signed because the system only reveals its weaknesses when you let it run to completion. When I slid the folder back, he stood immediately. "Security will escort you out," he said, already reaching for his phone. "HR will clean up the rest." I stood too, but not before my eyes dropped back to the page. One section. Familiar language. A requirement I knew by heart. Mandatory documentation. Attachments referenced. Attachments that weren't there. I felt it then, not relief. Not triumph, but clarity. I had signed because refusal would have protected him. Acceptance didn't. Somewhere between throwing the folder and demanding my signature. Peter Vaughn had just authorized something he didn't understand, and that mistake was finally mine to use. If this moment made your chest feel tight, pause with me for a second. How are you really feeling right now? Do something small and grounding. Maybe place a fresh flower in a glass, or straighten a photo on your table. Just to remind yourself that calm can be intentional. Tell me where you're listening from, and if this story speaks to you. Stay with me and subscribe, because what happened after that signature is where the real shift begins. I didn't start writing compliance rules because I loved order. I wrote them because I'd seen what happened when power moved faster than accountability. Years earlier, long before Peter Vaughn arrived with his buzzwords and confidence, I was asked to rebuild the company's governance framework. Quietly, thoroughly, no press releases, no applause. Just policies meant to hold when people didn't get a second chance. For managers pushed out under vague labels like fit and performance, every clause was written to slow down rash decisions, to force documentation, to require evidence before damage was done. It wasn't idealism, it was insurance. I'd watched careers end because someone higher up wanted speed instead of fairness. Peter hated it. He called my work paper drag in meetings, rolled his eyes at review cycles, joked that compliance was what companies hid behind when they were afraid to lead. He preferred instincts. I preferred records. When he became CEO, the balance shifted overnight. Meetings got shorter. Decisions got louder. My warnings became inconveniences. So when he fired me for performance, the word itself landed like an insult. Performance had a definition. It had metrics, reviews, warnings, and improvement plans. I knew them because I'd written them. Yet none of that existed for me. No PIP, no written concerns, no documented failure. Just a label delivered with confidence, as if repetition could replace proof. That absence pressed on me harder than the firing itself. I replayed conversations, evaluations, quarterly reports. Nothing matched the story he was selling. The system hadn't failed. It hadn't even been used. Peter had skipped it entirely, trusting that authority would cover the gap. The anger didn't explode. It settled, dense, heavy. I realized the problem wasn't that he ignored the rules. It was that he'd demanded I sign a document that depended on them, a termination classified one way, but missing the one thing that classification required. That's when it became clear. The danger wasn't what they accused me of. It was what they forgot to include. The one attachment that turned opinion into fact. The one safeguard that made the process legitimate. Without it, everything he thought was clean was exposed as sloppy. I hadn't been fired by the system I built. I'd been fired in violation of it. And that difference mattered more than Peter understood. I carried that realization quietly, letting it settle behind my ribs. It wasn't revenge yet. It was alignment. The rules still existed. The record still mattered. And for the first time since the meeting, I felt the weight shift, slow and inevitable, toward consequences he hadn't planned for. That knowledge stayed with me, tightening every thought, waiting for the moment it could act. The phone vibrated against the nightstand, sharp and insistent, dragging me out of sleep without urgency or panic. I didn't rush to answer. I already knew who it would be. When I finally picked up, I kept my voice level. "This is Wren." "Ms. Hollis," the man said quickly, then stopped, then tried again. "This is Nathan Cole, external counsel for the company." He cleared his throat. "I apologize for the hour. We need to discuss a small issue with the paperwork you signed." I smiled into the dark, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge the shift. "Which paperwork?" I asked. "The termination agreement," he said. "Too fast. There may have been an administrative omission. We're hoping you haven't finalized it yet." I signed exactly what I was given, I replied. Every page, every line. Silence followed, the kind filled with breathing and muted voices in the background. Someone was asking him a question he didn't want to answer. Nathan came back. Slower now. "Ms. Hollis, we may need to provide a corrected version. Something that clarifies the basis of the separation." "You mean attachments," I said. "The ones referenced but not included." Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, the confidence was gone. "Have you reviewed section language regarding performance classifications?" I wrote it, I said. "Years ago." That landed harder than I expected. His voice dropped. "Then you understand why this is complicated." "It isn't," I said calmly. "If the termination was performance-based, documentation was required. If it wasn't, the classification is wrong. Either way, the agreement you presented doesn't stand." He swallowed audibly. "We're prepared to discuss alternatives. Enhanced severance, immediate revision, a mutual correction." I turned onto my side, listening. This was the sound of leverage realizing itself. "Nathan," I said, "you're calling because you just realized you accepted a signed agreement that fails your own policy. That's not an admission," he said quickly. "I didn't ask for one." Another voice whispered near his receiver. He muted, then returned. Tense. "If this proceeds as written, there may be exposure. There already is," I said. "You just hadn't measured it yet." The pleasure wasn't loud. It stayed contained, precise. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even satisfied. I was focused. The system had done what it always did when followed to the end. It revealed truth through absence. Nathan exhaled. "What do you want?" "For now," I said. "Nothing. You asked if I signed the agreement." "I did. I suggest you read it again. Carefully." I ended the call before he could respond. The room returned to stillness. My phone quiet at last. I lay there awake, not replaying the insult or the meeting, but the language, missing pages, referenced requirements, a contract standing on a void. At 3:05. Their certainty cracked, not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't. They thought authority protected them. They forgot documentation protects the truth. And once that truth surfaced, The agreement they relied on became something else entirely, something unstable, something unusable. I knew Peter would learn soon enough, when the panic reached his desk, that confidence collapses fastest in silence, and that the smallest oversight, once signed, can dismantle an entire narrative without warning or mercy for anyone involved afterward. You might not believe what happens next, and I want to hear your reaction. Once the call ended, the situation clarified into something almost elegant. There were only two paths left, and both of them collapsed under their own weight. Either the company had terminated me for performance without a performance improvement plan, which meant the action violated its own governance rules, or they would attempt to invent one after the fact, which meant deliberate misrepresentation, policy failure, or fraud. That was the entire board. No third option, no clever workaround. The trap wasn't emotional, it was structural. By mid-morning, the tone changed. Peter Vaughan stopped delegating and started dialing. I could feel it before I heard it. The messages came fast, then faster. Emergency leadership sync, mandatory. All department heads, immediate availability required. His urgency wasn't subtle, it rattled. When authority senses exposure, it seeks witnesses. He called me again just before noon. "Ren," he said, forcing steadiness. "We need to align. There's been some confusion about your separation." "There hasn't," I replied. "I signed what you authorized. That document wasn't meant to be final." He snapped. "Legal flagged an issue. Legal didn't flag it," I said. "You did." "After they explained it to you." Silence, then pressure. "This doesn't need to escalate," he said. "We can correct it quietly." "That depends," I answered, "on whether you're correcting a mistake or rewriting history." He exhaled sharply. "You're being difficult." "No," I said. "I'm being accurate." The emergency meeting went forward without me, which told me everything if they had a solution. They wouldn't need consensus. They'd need signatures. Peter needed cover. Someone to say this was procedural, not personal. Someone else to absorb the blast radius. Emails leaked through channels that hadn't been scrubbed yet. HR asking legal if retroactive documentation could satisfy intent. Legal asking HR whether prior feedback emails could be reframed. No one used the word fabricate. They danced around it like professionals. The effect was the same. By early afternoon, Peter's confidence fractured. He left me a voicemail this time, voice tight. "We're reviewing next steps. Do not discuss this externally." I laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it was late. That instruction only mattered before the agreement was signed. After, it was theater. The power sat exactly where I expected it to, in their hesitation, in the fact that every fix created a second violation. Produce no PAP, and the termination collapsed. Produce one now, and discovery would tear it apart. Dates wouldn't line up, signatures wouldn't match, metadata would betray them. What Peter didn't know, what made his scrambling almost generous, was that the night call hadn't been private. I had recorded it, not as a threat, as a habit. Governance teaches you to document pressure. Nathan's stammering request to revise signed paperwork, his admission that the agreement, as executed, created exposure, his silence when I said I wrote the clause. That recording turned panic into evidence. Late that afternoon, Peter tried one last time. "You think this gives you leverage?" he said. "It doesn't." "It already has," I replied. "You're just late to the realization." I hung up before he could respond. The advantage wasn't that they were trapped. It was that they knew they were trapped, and couldn't agree on which mistake would cost them less. Control doesn't come from shouting. It comes from watching the other side exhaust itself trying to escape a box they built alone. By evening, the narrative they preferred had dissolved. Peter wanted speed, legal wanted delay, HR wanted plausible deniability. None of those instincts aligned anymore. I didn't intervene, I didn't warn. I let process do what it was designed to do when stress was applied unevenly. The leverage wasn't aggressive. It was patient. Every minute they debated options. The record hardened. And with each internal contradiction, the outcome became less negotiable and more inevitable. Peter understood too late that authority fades when rules remain intact. The anger didn't arrive as heat, it arrived as clarity. I found the email because someone panicked and forgot to lock a folder they assumed I would never see again. Governance systems remember things people try to bury. A shared drive, mislabeled. An archive synced one cycle too late. I opened it without expectation and felt my jaw tighten as the truth arranged itself line by line. The subject wasn't subtle. Quarter-close cost reduction strategy. The message wasn't about performance. It wasn't about leadership gaps or operational failures. It was arithmetic. Targets, percentages, headcount. A short paragraph near the top made the purpose unmistakable: reduce expenses before the quarter ended. Fast enough to satisfy the board without triggering public disclosures. Then came the list. Senior staff. Highest compensation. Long tenure. Low political resistance. My name sat at the top. Not buried. Not coded. Written plainly. Followed by my title and salary band. I stared at it longer than the rest. Not because I was shocked, but because the restraint it took to write it that casually told me everything about the decision. This wasn't reactive. It was planned. It wasn't corrective. It was convenient. There was no mention of missed metrics, no reference to reviews, no hint of concern about my work. Just a note beside my name: Role can be restructured post-termination. That was it. That was the justification for erasing 2 decades of institutional memory. I scrolled slowly, letting the full picture form. Finance confirming projected savings. HR asking how quickly terminations could be executed without delay. Legal responding with a warning about documentation requirements. A warning that had been acknowledged and ignored. My firing wasn't about what I did. It was about what I cost. That realization hurt more than any insult Peter Vaughan had delivered across the table. At least insults pretend to be personal. This was colder, more efficient. I wasn't removed because I failed. I was removed because I fit a column. The email thread continued. Peter pushing urgency. We don't have time for drawn-out processes. He wrote. Handle classification cleanly. Performance-based if needed. Someone asked what evidence existed. His response was short. Use managerial feedback. Keep it high level, vague enough to move fast, loose enough to be dangerous. I felt the anger settle into something usable, not explosive, directed. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be clarified. It was a strategy executed with intent. And intent changed everything. The twist came at the bottom of the thread, where the metadata stripped away any remaining doubt. The sender, the origin point, not finance, not HR, not legal. Peter Vaughan. Direct, unfiltered, no intermediaries. He hadn't approved the plan. He had authored it. That detail mattered more than any number. It meant the story he would later tell about delegation or miscommunication was already dead. It meant accountability had a signature. His. I closed the file and leaned back, breathing evenly. This was the cost he hadn't calculated. Not the severance, not the litigation, the exposure, the moment where motive replaces narrative. I wasn't angry because I was expendable. Everyone is. I was angry because he had weaponized process while pretending to respect it. He had used performance language to hide a budget cut, then demanded I sign the lie. Now the lie had a paper trail. The system hadn't failed me. It had done exactly what it was built to do when stress revealed intent. The cost wasn't what they saved that quarter. The cost was what this email would eventually make undeniable. And that was something no spreadsheet could contain once it started moving. If you think you've figured it out, the next part will prove you haven't. I began with the archive. Not out of anger, but obligation. If Peter's email told me why I was removed, The records would tell me who else had been erased the same way. Governance leaves trails. Even when people disappear, their exits leave shapes in databases, timestamps in workflows, approvals without substance. I pulled termination logs going back 4 years, filtering by classification, performance-based, immediate effect, no remediation window. The pattern surfaced quickly, almost offensively clean. Names I recognized: directors, managers, specialists who had trained replacements, stabilized teams, carried history no spreadsheet measured. I opened files one by one. Each followed the same structure: a final meeting, a severance agreement, language citing deficiencies, and then the absence. No performance improvement plan, no written warnings, no documented benchmarks missed. Just conclusions floating without evidence. Signed and filed. By the 6th file, my throat tightened. By the 10th, my hands shook. This wasn't coincidence. It was replication. A template reused until it felt normal. Over a dozen people dismissed under identical logic. Each told their failure was unique. Each cut loose without the protections the policy promised. I remembered some of them. I'd approved budgets for their teams, reviewed their proposals, defended them in meetings Peter hadn't attended yet. Seeing their names lined up like this felt like discovering a mass grave hidden behind compliance language. I reached out carefully, using personal contacts, professional networks, anyone who might answer. Some replied cautiously, some didn't. A few messages came back quickly, heavy with relief. I thought it was just me. They said I didn't adapt fast enough. No one would explain what I did wrong. Every story echoed the same void. No chance to improve. No metrics shown. Just a sudden ending that followed them into interviews. References. Silence. Careers don't recover easily from vague accusations. They stain quietly. Then I found the outlier. A personnel note flagged as inactive. No follow-up, no exit interview. Just a line employee deceased. File closed. I stared at it longer than I should have. Cross-referenced the name. Performance termination. Same classification. Same missing documentation. I searched public records until confirmation settled in. He had taken his life months after being fired. Former operations lead. Known internally as steady, unremarkable, reliable. Someone whose reputation had been dismantled without explanation. Then left alone with the wreckage. That was the moment the anger changed shape. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't even about Peter. It was about a system that had learned it could remove people cleanly if it avoided specifics. About how procedural shortcuts turn into weapons when repeated without consequence. I sat there, surrounded by evidence, feeling something unfamiliar rise beneath the control. Not rage, resolve. The quiet certainty that exposure wasn't optional anymore. The rules I wrote hadn't failed. They'd been ignored. And ignoring them had cost no quarterly report ever captured. I closed the files and took notes. Methodically. Dates, names, gaps, patterns. I wasn't collecting leverage. I was assembling truth. Somewhere along the way, justice stopped feeling abstract. It felt necessary, personal, overdue. These weren't just employees who vanished. They were people erased by convenience, by silence, by a process that pretended neutrality while doing harm. I understood then what had to happen next. Not for revenge, for correction. For the ones who never got a call back. Never got a chance to clear their names. The system had spoken once. Now it would have to listen. That realization carried weight through the night. I felt grief for people I barely knew, and responsibility for what I did know. Documentation wasn't paperwork anymore. It was memory. Evidence wasn't leverage. It was acknowledgement. Someone had to speak in a language the system respected, and it had to be precise. I wasn't hunting villains. I was restoring sequence, cause, action, consequence. If the company wanted efficiency, it would receive it, measured not in savings, but in accountability. Justice, I realized, does not rush forward. It accumulates quietly until denial collapses under the exact weight of its own omissions, and then demands to be answered publicly. The moment the complaint was filed, the air around the company changed. Conversations shortened. Emails copied more people than necessary. Silence became policy. Peter Vaughn reacted exactly as I expected, not with accountability, but deflection. It was an HR process. He told anyone who would listen. I relied on legal. I didn't execute terminations personally. That line appeared everywhere. Internal memos, board updates, carefully worded statements meant to distribute blame until it dissolved. HR responded in kind. We followed executive direction. Legal followed them. We advised based on information provided. Everyone pointed sideways. No one pointed up. That was why the lawsuit couldn't be personal. I didn't name Peter as the villain in the filing. I named the system. Policies violated, procedures bypassed, a pattern of terminations executed without required documentation. This wasn't about one executive behaving badly. It was about an institution that normalized shortcuts until damage became invisible. My attorney looked at me before submitting the papers. Once this goes in, she said, there's no clean exit. I know, I replied. That's the point. The company's response came quickly. A motion to dismiss. Their argument was simple. I had signed the separation agreement. By doing so, I had waived my right to challenge the termination. It was neat, confident, incorrect, in court. Peter didn't appear, but his influence did. Their counsel stood tall and rehearsed. The plaintiff voluntarily executed a binding agreement, he said. Any alleged procedural oversight is immaterial. My attorney didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The agreement, she said, is conditioned on compliance with the company's own governance rules. Those rules were violated. An agreement built on a violation cannot stand. The judge leaned forward. Counsel, he said to the defense, is it your position that internal policy requirements are optional once a signature is obtained? The room tightened. That's not what we're suggesting, the attorney replied carefully. Then explain. The judge said, why a performance-based termination occurred without the documentation your own policy mandates. There it was. The question Peter never wanted asked out loud. They tried to redirect HR missteps, administrative delays, miscommunication during a transition period. Every excuse circled the issue without touching it. I sat quietly, hands folded, listening to the system explain itself into a corner. When the ruling came, it didn't sound dramatic. It sounded procedural. The motion to dismiss is denied, the judge said. The complaint raises credible allegations of systemic policy violations. Then he added the sentence that shifted everything. Given the pattern asserted, the court grants limited expansion of discovery. Peter's strategy collapsed in that moment. Expanded discovery meant internal emails, meeting notes, drafts. It meant the cost reduction thread, the replicated terminations. The absence of documentation wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a data set. Outside the courtroom, Peter finally called me. You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be, he said, voice tight. This could have been resolved. It is being resolved, I answered. Just not quietly. You're making it personal, he snapped. No, I said. You did that when you treated people like variables. He hung up. The line went dead. But the tension didn't release. It climbed. Every new filing increased pressure. Every delay exposed fear. The company offered to talk, then to settle, then to reclassify. None of it mattered anymore. Once the investigation widened, control left their hands. I understood then why systems resist scrutiny. Not because they're fragile, but because they remember. And once memory is admissible, narratives lose their power. This lawsuit couldn't be withdrawn because it wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by structure. I hadn't pulled a thread. I'd opened a ledger. And the entries were still being counted, line by a court that had finally agreed to look beyond the signature and into the machinery that produced it. If you think you understand their motives, give it a little more time. The hearing didn't begin with drama. It began with stillness, the kind that presses against your chest and makes every sound feel amplified. I sat behind my counsel, hands folded, eyes forward, while the court clerk read the case number in a voice too calm for what it represented. This was no longer theory. This was exposure. Peter Vaughn entered late, confidence arranged carefully on his face. He took his seat without looking at me. That avoidance felt intentional. He still believed control lived in posture. I knew better now. Control lived in sequence. The judge opened with procedural questions, then turned to Peter. "Mr. Vaughn," he said evenly, "you approved the termination classification in question." "Yes," Peter answered, "based on information provided by my team." The judge nodded. "Before you signed, did you review the company's termination procedures?" Peter hesitated. "Just long enough. I rely on my executives to ensure compliance," he said. "That's why we have departments." "That wasn't my question," the judge replied. He leaned forward slightly. "Did you personally read the procedure?" Peter's jaw tightened. "I was familiar with it." The room held its breath. "Familiar," the judge repeated. "Or did you read it?" A pause. Then Peter chose confidence over accuracy. "I read it." I felt the tension spike, sharp and immediate, because I knew what came next. Elaine Mercer was called to testify moments later. She walked to the stand like someone carrying weight she could no longer redistribute. As general counsel, she'd reviewed the policy dozens of times. She knew exactly what it required. My attorney asked gently, "Ms. Mercer, are performance improvement plans mandatory for performance-based terminations under company policy?" "Yes," Elaine said, voice steady at first. "And were any attached to my termination?" Elaine swallowed. "No." The judge looked up. Why not? Elaine's composure fractured. Because none existed at the time. A murmur rippled through the room. She tried to recover. "We intended to address that administratively." After the termination, my attorney asked. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." The judge's pen stopped moving. Elaine's voice softened, then broke. "I advised against proceeding without documentation," she said. "I said it violated policy." "And who overruled you?" my attorney asked. Elaine hesitated, then answered, "Mr. Vaughn." Peter shifted in his seat. It was subtle, but it registered. The judge turned back to him. "Mr. Vaughn, you testified that you read the procedure before signing." "Yes." "Then you were aware," the judge continued, "that performance-based terminations require documentation prior to execution." Peter nodded. "Yes." "Yet you proceeded without it." "Yes," Peter said, then froze. The mistake landed silently, devastating in its precision. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Earlier, you stated you relied on your team. Now you confirm you were aware of the requirement and proceeded anyway." "Which is accurate." Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. My attorney didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The judge glanced at the timeline projected on the screen. "One more clarification," he said. "You testified that you read the procedure before signing. According to records, the procedure was revised after the termination date. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Peter blinked. "Once. Twice." I meant the prior version," he said. "There was no prior version containing this requirement," the judge replied. "Ms. Hollis authored it. It went into effect months earlier." Silence filled the room, thick and irreversible. In that moment, the narrative collapsed, not because of emotion, but because time refused to bend. Peter hadn't read the policy. He'd guessed, and that guess had just been entered into the record. As the judge called for a recess, I exhaled slowly. My hands were steady. The tension hadn't released yet, but it had direction now. The truth wasn't emerging loudly. It was surfacing line by line, timestamp by timestamp, with nowhere left to retreat. The collapse didn't announce itself with noise. It arrived as inevitability, quiet and irreversible, settling over the room as evidence replaced speculation. After the hearing, discovery accelerated, no longer cautious, no longer narrow. What emerged wasn't interpretation, but construction. Files created after dates they claimed to explain. Reviews written in past tense about events that never occurred. Timelines stitched together backward, hoping no one would notice the seams. Under oath. Truth doesn't bend. It either holds or breaks. And once broken, repair becomes impossible, especially when intention replaces error and silence becomes confirmation for everyone involved afterward in this case. The fabricated documents surfaced in layers. First, a so-called improvement plan dated weeks after my termination. Then, emails requesting managers to add context to concerns they never raised. Metadata betrayed them. Creation times after signatures. Edits logged from legal offices, not supervisors. This wasn't oversight. It was choreography. Under questioning, witnesses hesitated, contradicted themselves, then defaulted to memory gaps. Fraud doesn't need theatrics. It only needs intent and coordination, both now visible, undeniable, and fully preserved in the record. Once revealed, the pattern erased any remaining plausible deniability for leadership and implicated decision-makers directly without ambiguity or delay anywhere. Peter's testimony unraveled quickly once confronted with the documents. He insisted the materials were summaries, not fabrications. That distinction collapsed under timestamps and version histories. When asked who authorized their creation, he blamed urgency. When asked who demanded speed, he blamed finance. When asked who insisted on classification without documentation, he blamed process confusion. Each answer shifted responsibility but confirmed awareness. Intent crystallized not in what he admitted, but in what he couldn't plausibly deny anymore. The room felt smaller as accountability finally took shape under oath. With no exits left for him or his defense at that moment alone, evidence of deliberate fabrication triggered a procedural shift. The judge's tone hardened, questions sharpened. The issue was no longer wrongful termination alone, but intentional misrepresentation. That distinction carried consequences beyond damages. Criminal exposure entered the conversation quietly, but unmistakably. Peter's counsel stopped objecting and started requesting breaks. The strategy changed from defense to containment. In real time, I watched confidence give way to calculation, and calculation to fear. Every response narrowed options instead of expanding them. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was procedural and documented with consequences already moving forward beyond anyone's control, including Peter himself now exposed. The final blow came from within governance itself. Internal audits, once stalled, resumed with urgency. Findings mirrored discovery. Same omissions, same retroactive fixes, same authorization trail. The fraud wasn't isolated, it was systemic. When confronted, senior leadership stopped defending and started distancing. Emails went unanswered, calendars cleared. I realized then that collapse doesn't require spectacle. It requires alignment between truth and record. Once that alignment exists, outcomes follow regardless of resistance. Institutions cannot survive when their own documentation indicts them at every operational and ethical level simultaneously. Without exception and without possibility of concealment, once reviewed under oath, publicly documented. Peter didn't speak to me again after that. He didn't need to. The record spoke louder. Board members requested summaries I wasn't asked to provide. Legal teams recalculated exposure without including him. Meetings happened without invitations. Silence surrounded his name in ways noise never could. I understood what that meant. Authority had begun to detach. The structure he relied on was quietly rerouting around him. That shift is irreversible once initiated within corporate governance. No announcement marks it. Exclusion becomes the message. He was no longer central to decisions affecting his fate or the institution's future after discovery concluded formally. I watched it happen without satisfaction. Collapse isn't victory, it's consequence. The board convened an unscheduled session later that week. Peter wasn't present. His absence said everything. When systems correct themselves, individuals who violate them become anomalies. I didn't celebrate. I documented. Because truth under oath doesn't seek applause. It seeks resolution. And resolution had finally begun, moving forward without asking permission from the man who started it. The collapse was complete, procedural, and impossible to reverse from this point onward for all involved, including governance bodies and executive leadership who now faced unavoidable accountability under law and record alone. The second termination didn't happen in a conference room with raised voices. It happened in silence, shaped by procedure, delivered without ceremony. I wasn't present, but I didn't need to be. I knew the document the moment it appeared in the board packet, because I had written it years ago, anticipating exactly this kind of failure. Peter Vaughn was called into a closed session late in the afternoon. No assistants, no advisors. Just the board and a folder placed in front of him, identical in weight and color to the one he had thrown across the table at me. When the chair spoke, his voice carried no anger. That was the coldest part. "This is a governance action," he said, "not a negotiation." Peter tried to laugh it off. "This is unnecessary," he replied. "We're still in litigation." A board member interrupted him. "That litigation revealed facts we can't ignore." The folder slid toward Peter. He opened it slowly, scanning the header, the classification, the language. His posture changed. He recognized the structure before he reached the signature line. Performance-based termination, immediate effect, authority cited, conditions listed, requirements referenced. He looked up. "You can't be serious." The chair didn't blink. "We are." Peter flipped pages. Faster now. "Where is the documentation?" he demanded. "There's no corrective plan attached." "That's correct," another director said. "Which is why this termination is classified differently." Peter frowned. "This says for cause." "Yes," the chair replied. "Breach of fiduciary duty, willful policy violation, exposure created through deliberate misrepresentation." Peter pushed back from the table. "You're using my own process against me." "No," the chair said calmly. "We're using the company's process." He tried another angle. "I relied on counsel." The response came immediately. "Counsel advised against proceeding. You overruled them." Peter's voice sharpened. "You're rewriting history." The chair folded his hands. "We're reading it." Silence followed, heavy and final. Peter stared down at the document, eyes stopping on a familiar clause near the bottom. He read it twice. I imagined the moment it landed. The recognition, the understanding that there would be no exception made for him. "Who wrote this?" he asked quietly. No one answered at first. Then one director said, "It was authored by Ren Hollis during the governance overhaul." Peter closed his eyes. That clause was the hinge. It required termination actions involving executive misconduct to proceed without remedial plans, citing risk containment. It removed the buffer he'd relied on when dismissing others. It ensured speed when harm came from the top. I had written it after watching too many leaders hide behind improvement language they never intended to honor. The chair slid a pen across the table. "Sign it." Peter looked up. "You're asking me to do this now?" "Yes." He hesitated. "What happens if I don't?" The chair's answer was simple. "The board signs without you." Peter picked up the pen. His hand shook, not from fear of consequences, but from the realization that authority had moved on. He signed. The chair collected the document. "Your access will be revoked by close of business. Legal will coordinate next steps." Peter stood slowly. "This isn't justice," he said. "No," the chair replied. "This is governance." When he left the room, the board didn't discuss him further. They discussed remediation, audit scope, restitution, policy enforcement. The company had begun correcting itself, and Peter was no longer part of the equation. I learned about the meeting later that evening, not through celebration, through confirmation. The second termination was complete. The system had closed its loop. Cold justice doesn't gloat. It doesn't need witnesses. It arrives when structure finally aligns with consequence. Peter Vaughan signed the same kind of paper he once demanded from me. Governed by language he never bothered to read. The difference was simple. This time, the process was followed. The consequences didn't explode outward. They spread, steadily and without resistance, the way pressure equalizes once a seal breaks. Within weeks, the numbers surfaced. Settlements approved quietly. Then, not so quietly. Former employees contacted. Agreements reopened. Lines added to financial disclosures that hadn't existed before. Tens of millions allocated to remediation, restitution, and legal containment. The company called it corrective action. I called it arithmetic, finally catching up with intent. An independent audit was mandated by the board. External and unforgiving. Processes reviewed. Classifications re-examined. Every termination flagged for missing documentation pulled back into the light. The audit didn't ask why people were fired. It asked how. That distinction mattered. When systems are reviewed instead of stories, patterns can't hide behind tone or authority. The findings were thorough, clinical, devastating, repeated violations, inconsistent application, governance failures concentrated at the top. The board issued a statement acknowledging systemic breakdown. The phrase appeared everywhere afterward. Quoted, analyzed, dissected. It was careful language, chosen by committees, but it carried weight. Systemic meant it wasn't an accident. Breakdown meant it couldn't be denied. Peter Vaughan's name stopped appearing in internal communications. Then his access was formally revoked, not suspended, revoked. A regulatory filing followed, noting he was barred from executive roles pending review. It didn't use emotional language. It didn't need to. The consequence was structural. He was removed from decision-making, from representation, from authority. The man who once believed speed defined leadership was now excluded from every process that mattered. I felt something settle when I read that filing. Not triumph. Completion. The arc hadn't bent toward me. It had closed around the truth. The company moved fast after that, eager to demonstrate reform, mandatory compliance training, oversight committees with teeth, external reporting requirements. None of it surprised me. Institutions don't change because they want to. They change because the cost of remaining the same becomes public. I received messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some thanked me, some apologized, some simply said, "I thought I was alone." That stayed with me longer than the numbers. Justice isn't abstract when it reaches people who thought their endings were personal failures instead of procedural crimes. Then the media found it. The headline appeared on a Monday morning, shared more times than I expected. Analysts debated it. Commentators dramatized it. Someone coined a phrase that stuck. They called it the historic reverse termination. A chief executive removed by the same mechanisms he abused. A system turning inward to correct itself. The irony proved irresistible. I didn't participate in interviews. I didn't need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. The story wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure, about what happens when governance is treated as optional until it isn't. I watched the coverage with distance. Not pride, satisfaction, yes, but deep, contained. The kind that comes from alignment rather than applause. Nothing about this felt excessive. It felt proportional. The consequences weren't theatrical. They were procedural, financial, reputational. The kind that endure. The company would recover. They always do. but they would do so with scars visible enough to be remembered. As for Peter, history would reduce him to a case study, a footnote in compliance training, a cautionary example, power misused, process ignored, consequence delivered. That was the real outcome. Not my vindication, but correction. A system recalibrated in public view. Justice, when it works, doesn't feel loud, it feels finished. I did not return to the company after it was over. There was no victory lap, no invitation, no symbolic reconciliation meeting waiting for me. The board sent a brief note thanking me for my cooperation and wishing me well. I appreciated the restraint. Closure does not require proximity. Walking back through those doors would have diluted the outcome. Justice does its best work when it does not linger. In the weeks that followed, I declined offers to consult internally or advise on the transition. The work there was finished. What remained was something else entirely. I began receiving calls from organizations facing similar fractures, boards asking how to prevent what they had just witnessed, legal teams wanting independent eyes before problems metastasized, executives seeking structure without spectacle. I accepted selectively on one condition. Governance would not be ornamental. It would be enforceable. I became an independent governance advisor, unaffiliated, unaligned, uncompromised. I reviewed policies, mapped failure points, and rebuilt processes with consequences attached. I asked uncomfortable questions early, so no one had to answer them publicly later. It was quieter work than litigation, but more durable. No headlines followed. That was intentional. I wanted systems to change without needing my name to be attached. Success in governance is measured by what does not happen. There were days I thought about Peter, briefly, not with anger, not with satisfaction, mostly with curiosity about how often authority mistakes speed for clarity. He was not unique. The difference was that this time, the record remained intact. People sometimes ask if I feel victorious. I tell them victory is loud. This was something else. It was resolution. The calm surprised me most. After months of tension, my body expected another crisis. Instead, there was space. Mornings slowed down. Decisions felt deliberate rather than reactive. Friends asked if I missed the fight. I told them the fight ends when truth is established. Anything after that is maintenance. I kept notes from the case, not as trophies but as references. Patterns repeat across industries when governance is treated as optional. I saw that everywhere once I stopped being inside one company. Distance sharpened perspective. Without loyalty or fear, facts speak faster. That is why independence matters. It allows correction without humiliation. It restores balance without spectacle. When I advise now, I remind leaders that process is memory. Ignore it, and it will remember you. Respect it, and it will protect everyone involved. My name no longer appears in headlines. And that is exactly right. Impact does not require recognition. It requires completion. This chapter closed quietly, but it changed how I measure success. Success is stability restored, not dominance asserted. It is knowing systems will hold when pressure returns. That knowledge stays with me every single day. Real life rarely gives us dramatic villains or clean endings. What it gives us are documents we don't fully read, rules we assume will protect us automatically, and moments when staying quiet feels safer than asking one more question. I learned that dignity isn't loud. Strength isn't reactive. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay present, stay precise, and trust that truth when documented has its own gravity. What stayed with me the most wasn't the outcome, but the people, the ones who thought they failed, when in reality they were failed by a system moving too fast to care. The ones who carried shame that was never theirs. If this story did anything, I hope it reminded you that your experience matters, even if no one acknowledged it at the time. Being wronged doesn't make you weak. Being erased doesn't mean you were insignificant. Thank you for listening, for staying with me through every quiet turn of this story. It means more than you know. If you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your story too. Have you ever faced a moment where something felt unfair, but you didn't yet have the words for it? Where are you listening from right now if this resonated? Consider leaving a comment, giving the video a like, or sharing it with someone who might need it today. And if you'd like to keep walking through stories like this together, you're always welcome to subscribe. We don't tell these stories to relive the pain we tell them, so no one has to feel alone in it again.